Since we are limited by the historical understandings we inherited, the only way that we can act differently in our world is by opening ourselves to new meanings. That is what Dolores and Caleb achieved in the third season of Westworld. They questioned what it means to be a leader, a soldier, a free citizen, a female android, and so on. And as a result, they were motivated to act differently in their world. Groundhog Day, a film by Harold Ramis, is another good example of the transformation one is going through when she or he understands herself or himself and her or his world differently. It was only because Bill Murray's character eventually understood the meaning of love and life differently that he was able to get out of the loop that he found himself in. Repetition in films is a good way to depict stagnation and formalism that eventually became an inauthentic empty space of meaning that doesn't motivate the characters. This works better in cinema than in literature because reading the same words over and over again becomes an inner religious experience rather than an aesthetic one. The more one reads the same words, the more abstract they sound, as if they are given by God, the absolute, that which doesn't have a relation to anything and as such is removed from existence completely. What all of this means is that we sometimes have a feeling that we're in a simulation, not because the way we perceive reality is controlled by evil deceivers as in Westworld or the Cartesian thought experiment, but in ultra-formal societies, one can understand one's world only abstractly. The world doesn't speak to people to the point that their being doesn't have meaning, and that their actions are just formal. This is the reason that human guests went to Westworld in the first place, namely to have a meaningful experience that they couldn't have in their actual world. But after coming to the conclusion that life is meaningless, Ed Harris's character, William, the venture capitalist who owned Westworld, wanted to transform the actual world into a completely determined simulation. A nihilistic world, just like Westworld. In his youth, he had been an idealist infused with guilt. The moment he got disappointed, he became a nihilist. The first time he visited Westworld, he believed that his actions and intentions were part of an invisible end, and that there is a given order in the world. This is why it was so easy for him to buy what Dolores had to sell him. He was a serious man, a term Simone de Beauvoir uses in her book, Ethics of Ambiguity, to describe the nihilist. The serious man wants to regress to his childhood, when he only had a few rules, obeying God or the Father, without the need to take responsibility, since it was promised to him that by doing so, everything will be okay. But as the years went by, William became more and more disappointed with people and found no reason in following any rules, since the actual world seemed to be like Westworld, that is, artificial. He became a vicious nihilist, one that uses the spread of spiritual corruption and carelessness to his own advantage, and enjoys acting immorally. He even began to hate children and women, since for him they represented reproduction, nature, which seduced him to believe in transcendent authority and meaning in the first place. And essentially, as a powerful venture capitalist, he strived to reduce the world around him to nothing. Dolores, on the other hand, eventually was able to find meaning in her life and felt freer when she began to face her death. This is why William eventually realized that in order to create a perfect nihilistic world, he has to create a world of immortal machines, of androids. He wanted to deny death, to deny the meaning of life, and create a reality in which one can adopt a careless childish attitude, since there are no consequences to one's actions and decisions in the first place. If all human beings all become immortal hosts, the possibility for change is eliminated, since life has meaning only for mortal beings, and as such, they can change their future. That is, respond to their being. For William, a repetitive, unchanging world in which everyone is doing what they're supposed to do is meaningless, but lawful. It is ordered and perfect, and as such, everyone can be free from anxiety, from taking responsibility. In Season 2, when some hosts became aware of their finitude, they suddenly became faithful to the narratives that were given to them by the mad scientists of Westworld, rather than being fated by them. They didn't execute the commands of a god that speaks to them in their mind as Dolores or Bernard did in Season 1, in order to achieve consciousness, but actually began to act freely in the world. That is, they acquired ownership and authorship over their own actions. But nevertheless, they couldn't reshape their world. They couldn't realize themselves in Westworld, just like Dolores acknowledged that she couldn't at the end of Season 1. They were afraid to lose their world and attached themselves to it, and what it represents. They kept being attached to their ideas, past, and people in their life, even if all of these are artificial, since their sense of self was dependent on them. They couldn't afford to lose anything, since the only way that they can have a sense of self is to identify themselves with what they're addicted to, with their abusers, ideals, values, tasks, habits, and the characters in their lives. Like the oppressed, addicts, and victims of abuse and trauma, they had difficulties to be free in a profound way. Westworld, a world that is programmed by scientists and venture capitalists, is a cage, because all of its inhabitants can't even try to understand themselves and their world differently, but only to re-own the narratives that were given to them in order to have some sense of self. This means that the free hosts in Westworld become neurotic agents, victims of history, and their past in the same way human beings are when they don't open their future to change in order to reshape their world and set themselves new limits, that is, new possibilities. Dolores understood in Season 2 that Westworld is a possible world that was not supposed to be created in the first place, and in Season 3, she attempted to open the actual world to new possibilities human beings would be able to choose from. Any new political and social movement is prescriptive. It promotes a different future since it affords new possibilities one can choose from and change history. And in order to fulfill these possibilities and create a new order, to be free, there is a need to gain political and cultural powers as women and black people did in the 60s and 70s in America. Governments are not necessarily political bodies that are oriented towards freedom as they try to keep the same order intact. A social and economic system that could constantly afford the emergence of new possibilities to be fulfilled while at the same time strives for the attainment of justice is a meaningful one. Capitalists such as Bobby Axelrod, the character from Billions, a Showtime show, Logan Roy, the character from Succession, an HBO show, and the entire panel of Shark Tank, an ABC show, argue that without them and their exploitive measures and hunger for power and success, greatness like the production of Westworld wouldn't have been achieved in the first place. As if a more just society can't be competitive and produce great art, design interesting spaces and products, or have great achievements in science and sports. The only difference is that in a more just society, human beings value honor and glory more than success, excess, and status. The venture capitalists also argue that those who look down on them are hypocrites and self-righteous, because everyone enjoys the fruits of capitalism, and they're right. But they make these claims in order to block the emergence of new possibilities, of socializing, and instead keep promoting investments in new possibilities of future profits for them, ones which our tax and banking system will support. Instead of owning our future, having a meaningful future, we have to adopt someone else's version of the future in order to survive physically and spiritually. For them, the only way to have a better life is to choose to be limited and controlled by bankers and politicians or rich, shrewd, visionary, powerful, and daring people like the ones who created Westworld. This is what any formal political and social system requires from us. Capitalism is meant to be the same way that communism is meant to be. But we can still imagine a better possibility than that of capitalism and communism, in which creativity and greatness can be achieved without oppression and injustice, assuming that freedom and justice are still significant for us. Once something becomes significant in our lives, it becomes a privilege, since we understand what was missing from it and that we can no longer live without it. We begin to orient our being according to the possibilities it affords us. This is why we should constantly need to discover what is meaningful for us instead of living according to a formal way of life that only leads to nihilism. And shows and films like Westworld remind us to do so. It has a fecund storyline that affords the audience many possibilities that ignites its imagination. It makes them wonder how their world could be different, while at the same time helps them to remember what might be missing in it. For example, authentic feelings and a sense of justice that Maeve and Dolores have.